Continuing now reading out Thomas Cookson's review for Time and the Rani. I strangely thought that the early regeneration was the least of the story's problems. It must be said, though, that Time and the Rani saw the most arbitrary and pathetic regeneration of them all. I'm not referring to the fact that it's Sylvester McCoy and Collins a wig disguised by bad special effects. I'm referring to the fact that the regeneration just happens out of the blue in the first scene. Most doctors regenerate as an act of self-sacrifice or are unable to escape a fate that pursues them relentlessly. In the case of the 10th planet and Logopolis, the death and rebirth of the Doctor is reflected metaphorically by a decaying planet. Collins' regeneration just feels like washing our hands of him. You can tell no one's really thought about how the regeneration is meant to define this Doctor. With the opening stories of William Hartnell, Patrick Troughton, Tom Baker, and Colin Baker, we got to learn about their defining ruthless methodology. John Pertwee's debut showed us his ability to win through gadgetry, and even Peter Davison's debut showed his strength of innocence at inspiring people's better nature. Sylvester's debut just portrays him as a prat who does a lot of running around, falling over, and there's nothing inspiring about it. Doctor Who has often had a capacity to rise above its long-running cheap or camp aspects. Take, for example, the much-derided scene in The Seeds of Death, where Patrick Troughton is being chased by ice warriors. That scene may be played for Benny Hill-style comical effect, but it explores the labyrinth of this futuristic base under siege and does it efficiently, whilst the ice warrior around every corner gives the environment a sense of claustrophobia. So whilst the scene is comical, its implications are still pretty frightening and play a part in the tension. Take also the scene where we see the bubble wrap on Noah's Arm in the Ark in space. Yes, it's obviously bubble wrap, but the makers have made an effort to have it look organic by gluing hairs onto it, and from where I'm standing it works, and it's a very subversive effect on me as a viewer. Despite myself, I actually find myself scratching my arm compulsively whenever I see that scene. This didn't rise above the cheap or the camp, it drowned in it. It's seemingly unable to swim or stay afloat, even if it's in its own waters. All in all, it was terrible and tedious. For instance, what should have been the comedy highlight of the episode, and indeed the main reason I wanted to see the story, the scene where the brownie dresses up as Mel to fool the Doctor, ends up somehow being the most drawn-out and boring segment of the thing. It was played for a serious dramatic manipulation of allegiances, done with neither urgency or irony, but then again, the 80s era always did have a problem with irony. Just look at how seriously they took Adric. It's actually quite amusing to me that John Nathan Turner still rattled off the memory cheats catchphrase the same year that an abomination like this was shown on TV and The Talons of Wen Chiang got released on video. Still, at least the memory cheats is a lot less disparaging at fandom than Russell's emotionally insecure straight males in Outpost Gallifrey who wish it was still 1976. That's one reason why, despite my opinion of John Nathan Turner as a producer, I still respect him a lot as a person, far more than I do Russell T Davies. John Nathan Turner was never disparaging or insulting about the fans, even when he took a lot of nasty shit from them, and Russell's unprofessional, sneering remarks about fandom would be immature enough, but the fact that so many of his fans can be just as obnoxious and unreasonably bitchy makes me really hate Russell, since I've certainly been on the receiving end of their nastiness on the internet. So why was the show so clunky and bumpy? Well, the 80s in general seemed stuck with a kind of modernist black and white view of morality, not just in Doctor Who, but in cinema in general. As such, much of that era just seemed very self-righteous, angry, small-minded, and neurotic. The Doctor became a figure of extremes, starting as the innocent one, and then, when fans complained that he was bland, the production team didn't work by subtly darkening the character or drawing on his more cranky or manipulative old traits, but by outright turning him into Mr. Hyde. As if the fan-pleasing nature of the show, the production team wanted the Doctor to be untrustworthy and ruthless, but didn't take matters such as motivation into consideration, and the result was going all the way in the desperate hope of shocking everyone. Am I actually talking about the show's morality here? Well, yes, because there was a horrible melodramatic 80s trend in dinosaur masculinity in which men are shown to do brutal things out of nobility or committing vile acts or exhibit misogynistic behaviour to show that they're capable of feeling guilt for it. And it's the same way that in Warriors of the Deep, Twin Dilemma, and Trial of a Time Lord, the Doctor commits vile acts or does nothing to prevent them, simply as an excuse for him to show remorse later. A horrible trend of that kind died in the McCoy era, but not until Time and the Rani had the last word on that trend. The Doctor pushes a tetrap onto that bubble death device for no other reason than so he can act sorry afterwards. And of course the awful story ends with a final nail in the coffin. And I mean final nail, I mean it's one of those just when you think it's nearly over and it can't get any worse. In that horribly repellent moment where the leader smashes the Doctor's antidote to the killer bees, makes some heavy-handed point about progress, which to me is the most neurotic and hostile moment of the show, like an abusive husband smashing things in front of you to prove themselves right. This 80s mentality didn't believe in civil disagreements. The hero was right, and anyone who disagreed with him was to be despised and most certainly killed off, or at least punched out. A bit like in Warriors of the Deep, rather, though it should be noted that the Doctor's angle tended to be polar opposite to most 80s rogue cop cinema. The Doctor was the bleeding heart liberal, and the trigger-happy heroes were the ones to be despised. This 80s cinematic mentality placed little value on life, as we see when one of the Lakatians makes a noble sacrifice that clearly didn't need to be made at all. The story just required a death at that point. The story may look colourful and child-friendly, but it's every bit as nasty as the previous era. This 80s mentality was the worst in moral double standards, for as much violence splashed on screen as possible with a stern sexual morality that bordered on the lunacy of gender segregation and male/female mutual violent hostility and constant rape/stalker paranoia. And it's the kind of thing that influenced for no hanky-panky in the TARDIS ethos, something that the new series seemed to be aggressively overcompensating for. Normally I wouldn't have a problem with that. I don't particularly like the chase Doctor Who of the 80s, and I quite liked the more flirtatious, slightly metrosexual Doctor of the Graham Williams era. What I mind about the new series is that all the flirtations and romantic tension and sexual innuendos all come off so desperately, crying out to be seen as not being puritanical, same way it desperately cries out to not be seen as humorless or out of touch with popular tastes. And of course, there is the way the romantic angle of the show turns the Doctor and companion into jealous, neurotic, antisocial pricks. But the point is that this is what meant that the Sixth Doctor had to prove his chasteness whilst around a provocative companion like Perry by being constantly mean and violent towards her. And I'd say it is why Mel and the lead Lakatian have such an adversarial relationship, even though it's clear that if this was a Pertwee story, there'd certainly be romantic interest. But instead, the lead Lakatian has to be dismissive and brutal and intimidating to warn any interest off. It just happens this way. Whenever things in society become more conservative, television and cinema have to stop being challenging and become more modernist and reactionary, and the 80s certainly was a reactionary decade. Indeed, in that regard, it is commendable that Doctor Who still managed to put out challenging stories like Warriors Gate, Legopolis and Kinder, but by and large the approach was to make audiences stupid, complacently unquestioning, and politically disinterested, and that the lobotomizing of Doctor Who in seasons 22 to 24 plays a part. There's nothing more humiliating and helpless, emancipating and dysfunctional than stupidity. That's why much of season 24 is so painful to watch, especially for a show that once had its heart in the idea of knowledge as empowerment. The new series is stupid in a different, more TV-savvy way. The endings of World War III, New Earth and The Runaway Bride are an inexpressibly idiotic nonsense that completely ignores even the most basic laws of physics, and yet Russell knows how to make them work televisually. The result is that I get suckered and then I get angry and insulted that I went with it, and my infuriation of New Who grows. And yet Russell's fans say we're trying too hard to see fault in it, but this doesn't even do that. There's no damage control whatsoever, just lots of embarrassingly desperate comedy pratfalls and the Doctor at his most brainless doing a lot of irony-free falling over, and like Mr. Blobby, I kind of wished he wouldn't get back up. Some fans say it's so bad it's funny, but I still don't see it. It's not remotely cheerful, it's not amusing in the slightest. Oh, and when the Doctor has a melancholy moment of realising he was duped and telling Mel how useless he feels. My god, this show seriously thinks it's being profound and poignant, and it's just hopeless. It's like the show's gone completely senile and it's tragic to watch. You just want to put the show down like a dog that's on its last days and has lost all dignity. There's no warmth to the dialogue, the sets are completely bland, the Rani is the model for a generic cackling Who villainess who shows up just what a low opinion of itself the show now has. I thought it'd be a fun slice of stupidity and campiness, but there was nothing fun about it. Time Flight is the Jump the Shark story, but if I'd been a fan back in the 80s, it'd be this story that would completely finish me off. The show would rediscover the frivolity and resourcefulness that makes the show work on the cheap, but this was simply cheap and uncheerful. The vilified reputation of this story obviously will make it a curiosity to those fans who have never seen it. I implore you not to watch it all the same. Even out of curiosity, some things should just be forgotten like a bad dream.